Hey there troops, it's me TheTacticalBrit, and something I want to discuss today is something that I feel is very important to Battlefield 5, and more importantly, I think it's almost crucial to how many players are actually going to buy the game and whether or not the game will last in the future, and that is of course Tides of War. Now I've touched upon this in the past and I've mentioned it in some previous dynamics before, but I've never actually really gone into a deep dive about Tides of War and what to anticipate, and in my opinion what is the biggest problem and potential threat that Tides of War could give to Battlefield 5. Now we've already had two chapters of Tides of War that have been confirmed. We've had the Fall of Europe as well as the Greek resistance that has been confirmed so far. And these look really interesting. It looks like the idea of Tides of War is to take us to lots of different places during the conflict, which is something I can totally get behind. But I think at the moment what we are lacking are figures and statistics. Now, I have noticed that DICE and EA have been much more communicative of lately. We've had blog posts that have more or less detailed everything about certain aspects of the game, even like little gritty details such as how many weapons and vehicles and sidearms and melee weapons there'll be, which has been really good to see, and I have no doubt that somewhere down the line we will see something similar for Tides of War that will kind of give us a rough roadmap. But at the moment, and I say at the moment because this is really important, I think Tides of War currently has the threat of being to Battlefield 5 what the anticipation for No Man's Sky was to No Man's Sky. Now I know this is a very weird kind of analogy, so to speak, but let me dive into what I'm talking about here. No Man's Sky was a game that very much rested upon the promise of future updates improving the game. I think once it released especially and people realized that certain aspects of the game were pretty disappointing and it didn't live up to expectations, it very much had to rely on what it had in its locker down the line in order to get people back over. Now, Battlefield 5 is not in a very similar situation. I actually think the launch content for Battlefield 5 is looking really incredible, as well as the core gameplay loop, which is something that they very much have in their war zone, so to speak. It's something that they can bring to the field and it's going to do great, and I think lots of fans will really appreciate it. But there is, of course, that cloud of fans who are very much concerned about the future of the game. And is this just going to be a Battlefield that they pick up for a month, play, and put down? Much like people picked up No Man's Sky, played it, and then put it down. And this is something I've noticed a lot in developer conversations and on the internet as well, that in almost every blog post and in almost everything Battlefield seems to mention, Tides of War comes up, and there's always some kind of notion that Tides of War is going to bring something to the game further down the line that will keep us all interested, and we have actually seen some elements of that. We have seen, of course, that there are going to be new settings, but more importantly, we've seen even small things like that there will be weapons in Tides of War slowly being progressively added to the game, some of which have even featured in some of the dev talks. They're none of the guns that are on the confirmed list, but it does look as though they're almost finished and can be in the game in Tides of War not too far down the line. There is, of course, the distinct lack of the M1 Garand, for example, which would be absolutely miraculously surprising if it didn't feature in Battlefield 5 at some point. But I think the big concern here, and this is where things get tricky, is that when a company and a game dedicates so much time and attention to something like Tides of War, there is of course the worry that fans will take it too far. And this is exactly what happened to No Man's Sky. With No Man's Sky, people kind of made their own presumptions as to what the live service would look like, and what it would offer them and what it would give them, and you know, just how great it would be. And naturally, when the game didn't deliver to certain wild expectations that were completely unrealistic of a dev team of that size, the game faltered and people got very negative very quickly. Naturally, I can see the same patterns emerging here in Battlefield 5. We have a live service which so far has only actually detailed 2 settings, but it hasn't actually detailed how many maps, what modes, how many weapons, and what the overall plan is really. It's supposed to be an addition to the game, but at this point that addition could be wild. It could be anything from, you know, the fall of Europe to Japan. It could be just Europe, it could be just Greece, it could be, you know, maybe 2 or 3 locations at best, and there is no specification for the scope and scale of this live service. And I think part of the problem with that is that DICE and EA themselves don't actually know the scope and scale that they want to attempt with this live service. And there are 2 things about this that make this very tricky. The first one is at the moment we do have no roadmap, and this is a huge threat to the game because it kind of undermines a lot of people's intentions with the game. Like, I do want to get Battlefield 5, and I solely appreciate the fact that I will be playing it for a long time, but if there's no specified amount of things that are going to come, or a rough approximation at least that we're going to have a certain amount of content updates and packs that will drop in the game, I'm more or less sat here like, well, is this just going to be another Star Wars? Now, I know that isn't going to be the case, and rationally speaking, Star Wars had to completely redesign its progression system before it could actually bring a live service to the table, and that's not something Battlefield currently has to be worried about. But what is concerning is the fact that much like Star Wars, where there was no roadmap, there is this just sort of sitting anticipation as to whether or not fans will get a rough idea of what's coming, or whether or not what is coming will actually be what they anticipate it coming. And this is the second problem. The second problem here is that with this anticipation and so much emphasis being put on Tides of War, without a roadmap and without a true understanding of the scope and scale of what Tides of War is aiming to be, the big issue is that a lot of people are speculating, and some of them are speculating far too far, and it's just not very good for the game. Like, I've seen some people say, oh yeah, Tides of War is going to take us to, like, I don't know, the arse end of nowhere in World War II. Maybe we'll have the Russian front, maybe we'll have this front, maybe we'll have that front, and it gets very messy very quickly. And the problem with this is that with all this anticipation of all these areas, fans themselves are bringing up their own preconceptions as to what they believe Tides of War will be. And, I'm no alien to this. I would love Tides of War to feature the Pacific front. I would love Tides of War to feature the Russian front, and, that would be beyond my wildest expectations. But as somebody who understands game development, I think, a lot more than, the common YouTuber or the common user these days, especially since talking to some of the DICE devs so extensively, I think certain things are unrealistic, especially when you're looking at a service here which isn't requiring you any money. Like, you don't have to pay for Tides of War, so naturally my intuition said, well, there will be less content and perhaps it will be a little less diverse, and I'm willing to accept that as something that is free for the game. But I think the problem at the moment is that we've got lots of people who are just jumping to conclusions that we're going to get a Battlefield premium style of content and something that will be very intense and feature, 4 or 5 maps every couple of months and not have to pay for it. And I think that's a wild expectation that should be avoided at all costs, because it just simply isn't realistic with a service that isn't actually being paid for. Unless the game really takes off and does very well on cosmetics and microtransactions in that field, I really just don't see the game featuring that degree of content. And I might be wrong. I might be incredibly wrong. I think DICE has surprised us a lot so far. I think the announcement of a live service without any cost was a huge surprise in the first place, and it wouldn't surprise me to see them throw all their chips into the table, so to speak, and go all in here, and actually really try and get people onto Battlefield 5 in the future. And I think, having a live service that is extensive and having one that does feature a lot of content will be something that would definitely do that for a lot of fans, but I just don't see it happening. So, what's my solution here? I just really think that DICE should announce how many maps, modes, and weapons are going to be coming within the first phase of Tides of War at least. That will give us a realistic expectation at least as to what the other themes for Tides of War will be like and how many maps and modes and guns will be in them. If they announce that the Fall of Europe has maybe 2 maps and, I don't know, 4 or 5 weapons, that's great. That's exactly what they need to do, and detail everything about it, and that way we can get sort of realistic expectations for what the future will hold. So troops, that's about it from me today, the Tactical Brit. Let me know what you think down in the comment section below. Is Tides of War something you're worried about, or is it something you're really anticipating? As always, thank you for watching, and I'll catch you again soon in another video.